understanding how the FBI's rules work helps me understand why they wanted that document. And I'm sure what it was they were going around concerned about the Black Lives Matter movement, but it didn't fit in their normal category of black separatism, right? That's sort of the category they had that was the threat in Georgia, right? This black separatist idea. But Black Lives Matter isn't really a black separatist organization, so I'm sure they probably got some internal pushback in some offices where they said, well, you know, this isn't a group. So they create black identity extremists, certainly under the definition Black Lives Matters, black, and concerned about police violence. So they sort of are the target of this activity, and we've seen there's been a lot of good reporting. A lot of Black Lives activists talk about getting home visits from the FBI and getting visits to their workplaces, like other activists, like we've seen. You know, one of the issues that that CARE has brought out, which doesn't get talked about enough, during the 2016 election, the FBI's fanned out, much like the 2001 effort to go interview a bunch of Muslim men. They interviewed at least 109. 109 people complained to CARE that the FBI knocked on their door shortly before the election and asked them general questions of whether they knew about any threats to polling places. So imagine you're thinking, I'm going to go down and vote in 2 weeks at a polling place that the FBI thinks I might bomb. You know, would I want to go down there? Number one, would I want to go down there because if somebody does bomb it and I went down there, maybe they would suspect me. But two, if there really is going to be a bombing down there, that's the last place I would want to go or to have my family go. And I think it was an effort to suppress the vote in the Muslim community. And obviously there were some other shenanigans, not involving the Joint Terrorism Task Force with the election last year, or 2 years ago. So, you know, clearly the FBI needs greater oversight. And unfortunately, the way the rules work now, there's no way to impose that oversight. So I'm excited that Portland will now regain this leadership role that it has had on this issue, this time with support from other cities like San Francisco and Oakland, to finally pull themselves out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
One of the main things to realize about the current climate in which we're dealing with is, number one, on a political accountability level, we're dealing with politicians that don't have to explain arguments. And as a former debater, I'm very troubled by this. When I hear Mayor Wheeler come out with statements about the JTTF that we're very satisfied with them, and then he says nothing else. And then I'm thinking, why did I get a law degree if I can't use it? To date, what we have seen from the Muslim community is that there's been several hate crimes that have happened all across the state. And one would assume that you would have JTTF officers involved in these hate crime situations, and then the DOJ would bring forth federal hate crime charges. They have not. Since the election of Donald Trump, not a single case has gone to a federal court. That's troubling. So what are they doing? What they're doing is a couple of different things. Number one is that, like Mike talked about, what's happening to the Muslim community, both in Portland and in surrounding areas, is that the Muslim community is starting to feel like they have to remain a close-knit community. And I thought it was a really striking example of this, and I just realized this when I was at Wujimaya and Beaverton over the weekend, in which you had such a diverse community going to shop there. But if you go to like Muslim restaurants and if you go to Muslim businesses, you won't see the same diversity there. You'll see mostly the Muslim community that's staying within themselves. And as a result of constantly being targeted by the FBI and by law enforcement looking into them, what you have is a community that is doing two things. Number one, they're staying within their homes, they're staying within their communities, and number two, they are not being engaged as part of the political process. Okay, just look around. You're not going to see a lot of Muslims in this audience unless they're stealthing and they haven't told me yet. That's troubling. Okay, that's not the Portland that we want to see, in which Muslims are afraid to just be a part of the political process and participate as fully as the rest of us. On a second level, on a mental health level, What's really significant is what this does to communities is that it creates trauma and it creates vicarious trauma. So let me talk about those two components. Trauma is direct, okay? It happens directly to you where you see a situation and you witness it and you feel impacted in a way that it lowers your mental health, okay? You really you lose self-confidence and emerges in a variety of different ways. The other thing that's become increasingly prevalent within the Muslim community is vicarious trauma, meaning you hear about an incident and it also traumatizes you. You hear about the news, you hear what's happened to this particular community member or this person, and it traumatizes you as well. And we've actually seen legitimate situations in which the FBI has gone on to communities and tried to interview people. That person has told the community about their experience, and other people have become very concerned about what's happening.
Our lives were changed forever when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on Sunday morning on December 7th, 1941. So by 2:30 on that afternoon of that day, the FBI swarmed over the Japanese neighborhoods and began arresting community leaders. So if you were a businessman, a doctor, a newspaperman, a Buddhist priest, a Japanese language teacher, you were arrested. So in Portland, a total of 110 community leaders were taken by the FBI from their homes and were placed in the Multnomah County Jail and Rocky Butte jails. So none of these people were charged with a crime, and for several days their wives and families had no idea what happened to them. And some families were not reunited for 2 years because these men were mostly men. They didn't consider women community leaders. They were taken to Department of Justice camps outside of the area of Portland. So obviously, the FBI had been investigating the Japanese community and had come up with a list of people, or a list of suspicious people before Pearl Harbor happened. So the government identified these Japanese as a national security threat solely because of their ancestry, and despite the fact that surveillance by the FBI had found no sabotage or subversive activity. So General DeWitt, who was the commander in charge of the defense of the West Coast at the time, proclaimed the very fact that no sabotage has occurred to date is a disturbing and confirming indicator that such action will be taken. So wartime hysteria, sensationalized by the media, and vote-seeking politicians overwhelmed and contradicted the government's own research, and that fact was kept secret until the 1970s, and it was uncovered by a researcher. So when America felt threatened, we strayed from our democratic ideals under the guise of military necessity. So what happens after 9/11? You know, America had another catastrophic attack. Thousands of New Yorkers lost their lives because of a terrorist attack. So suddenly we're facing a new enemy. How are we going to respond to this new threat to our national security? And we cannot let prejudice and fear guide our government policies. And thank goodness, you know, we have some allies. You know, when in 1941, the Japanese had very few allies. We were kind of on our own. And so our local police department should be protecting our citizens and not conducting investigations that conflict with our local sanctuary laws, and we are very fortunate we have a sanctuary law. And we shouldn't be using our scarce resources to enforce the federal laws.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm a Muslim American. I'm an attorney. I have been since around 2000. I practiced in Oregon. My first law firm, first place I practiced was in Newport. This was I started in 2000. I was there for just a little over a year. Then we heard about the tragic events of September 11th. I wanted to start my own practice. I moved back to Portland, started practicing, and I actually represented Jeffrey Battle, not him, but I tried to get his son Esau. Jeffrey Battle is one of the Portland Seven who was accused of going to Afghanistan to fight with the Taliban. Never got there, but he did time for that. His son was needed, he needed to be placed in the custody of a responsible adult, and that was my role. So this was around 2002, 2003. When I came back to Newport after September 11th, I had this experience that these panelists were talking to you about, that Marleen said people in the Japanese community were experiencing earlier, and this knock on the door. I would have Muslims come up to me because they knew I was a Muslim here in the Portland area and say, somebody came to my work, they said they wanted to talk to me, they came to my house, they wanted to talk to me, what do I do? I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm not a criminal defense attorney, so I told them, go see a criminal defense attorney, go to the Federal Public Defender's Office. So I had a list of where they go to. And that impacts, as Zakir said, that impacts me as a Muslim because I'm seeing this in my community. And as he said, it's something that it's like a feedback loop. And I didn't actually fully appreciate it. And even you saying that, helps me to understand that, because shortly hereafter is my story. I got arrested, and I know it impacted the community, but sometimes I don't even know how much my own arrest impacted the community and probably generated more fear in the community. But most of you probably know my story, but long story short, May 6, 2004, I was arrested in connection with the Madrid, Spain bombing, which is crazy because I thought that was, whoever did that I remember coming home and telling my wife when that happened, saw it on the news, I said, I don't know who did this, I don't know if they're Muslim or otherwise, but whoever did it are criminal of the highest order. That was kind of my feeling, and yet here I was arrested shortly thereafter, this Madrid, Spain bombing in connection. And what was it based on? It was based on a faulty fingerprint. That is, the government said that they had a latent print found on a bag in Spain, and they thought it was mine. Even though in an affidavit in support of my arrest, they didn't tell the local judge, Judge Jones here in Portland, that the FBI had actually gone to Spain and asked them their opinion, and what do you think their opinion was? Before my arrest on May 6, 2004, before that, in April, they had asked the FBI, April 13th, and they said no, negative, negativo, really big on a memo. I could show it to you. So they knew, and yet they withheld that from the federal judge, and they used this arrest to do an in warrant around probable cause, the Fourth Amendment. They arrested me under material witness statute. And, well, you guys, you know the story. Long story short, every justification beside that phony fingerprint was that I was a Muslim or I associated with Muslims, that I had represented Jeffrey Battle, a Muslim, that I got a call from Pete Seda, who was an arborist Muslim in Ashland, that my wife was Mona, a.k.a. Muhammad. And therefore, I mean, the only conclusion you could draw was I was being arrested for being a Muslim or associated with Muslims. And here's the key takeaway. There was a memo sent by the FBI, Beth Ann Steele, May 5th, 2004, the day before I was arrested, saying that they didn't have probable cause that I committed a crime, and that they would arrest me as a material witness if I was outed by the media. So they arrested me because they were afraid that the media was going to leak this, and that's important because they admitted that I didn't have probable cause. And why is that important? Because what Mr. German was telling you is this threshold is being lowered. So we've had the Fourth Amendment around for like over 240 years that says you can't search somebody, arrest them, you can't seize the material unless you have probable cause they committed a crime. And then all of a sudden you have this exception that says we can do it if we're just gathering intelligence if we're doing investigations for foreign intelligence purposes, like national security. But you can't use that, you can't breach this wall between our privacy and local criminal investigations, and yet that's what Mr. German was trying to tell you. Has happened, it is happening, it's happened. Our Fourth Amendment rights are being diminished, and they were even further diminished with the Patriot Act, which lowers the threshold. First is probable cause, then it's reasonable suspicion. Now there's almost practically no suspicion. And that's a scary thing. I want to give you one example of the JTTF violation, and it's me personally. So Mike said that he did FOIA requests, and he could see some of the actions of the JTTF. Let's not go anywhere else, but let's look at me personally. So, again, I'm arrested May 4th. Before that, there was this investigation where the federal government was investigating me, special agents and local Joint Terrorism Task Force agents. I'm going to share with you from a surveillance log detailing surveillance conducted on March 24th, 2004, shortly after this investigation of myself and my family. March 21st, 2004, at 1:03 p.m., the special agent in front of my house, which is in Beaverton, Oregon, reported me leaving in my maroon Chevrolet, which had one door was falling off, and I had it like wired shut, this crappy maroon car that I had at the time. It documented me going to a gas station, going to a Big Five sporting goods store, placing an item in my trunk, then removing said suspicion item at my house with my co-conspirator. It was my son, my 15-year-old son, Shane. What was a suspicious and potentially dangerous item being removed from my trunk? It was a basketball and a basketball hoop. Okay, that's not the important part. The important part is that the same special agent who's at my house reports me departing at 3:19 p.m. and at 3:40 p.m. the task force agent, that's the Portland, task force agent, reports me, the subject, standing in front of the Belial Mosque in Beaverton, Oregon. So think about that. The FBI admitted they had no evidence I'd committed a crime, and yet the FBI and task force proceeded to collect information about my religious activities and associations. So Portland task force members were violating Oregon law, which prohibits collecting any information based on one's religious, ethnic background. Does everybody see how our Portland task force agents were violating the law back then? And I've asked every city council member, can you tell us honestly if you know if Portland task force members are or have been in front of our Portland area mosque right now or before? And none of them can say that they can tell you that.
To the extent that there are real terrorists, right? I mean, this methodology that the FBI uses now is unfortunately has become very common, but when it started, it was very uncommon. Before 9/11, if I'd gone to the FBI and said, I want to do an FBI sting, a terrorism sting operation, they would say, okay, what terrorist group is the person involved in? And I said, well, they're not involved in any terrorist organization. It's like, okay, well, what kind of weapons do they have? Well, they don't have any weapons at all. Okay, well, what kind of resources do they have to buy weapons? No, they don't have any weapons. They don't have any resources to buy weapons. The operation will be giving them weapons that they can't afford. Okay, well, what's their plot? Well, they don't really have a plot. What we're going to do in the operation is provoke them along until they develop a plot. They would have sent me for psychological counseling, and rightly so. So this methodology is something that's very new and isn't really designed to catch terrorists. It's designed to trick gullible people into engaging in a manufactured plot. These cases are on a spectrum, and it's not necessarily that there wasn't some law enforcement attention that was justified in many of these cases, but I see the Portland case as really one of the more cynical ones. Number one, because there was this issue about the Portland police not participating in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and the agreement was that if there was an important terrorism investigation, they would contact and make sure the local authorities were aware, and didn't do that. But number two, that they made it so theatrical, right? I mean, if the FBI had left this person alone, they would have been on a fishing boat in Alaska. They prevented them from taking that job because they kept this operation going. And this is a person who had no direct contact with any real terrorist groups. They had not traveled overseas to any kind of terrorist training camp or gone to any imaginary terrorist training camp here. They had no weapons. I don't know if you know this, and I hate to be giving out information that might be used in the wrong manner, but it's actually really easy to get weapons in this country, right? If you have somebody who the government is saying is a terrorist who's never gone to the trouble of actually obtaining a weapon, that's, again, what we used to call a clue, right? And to the extent that the FBI did believe that whatever email and online activity this person was involved in was dangerous, developing a plot around that and particularly targeting a religious event, the Christmas tree lighting, I think was really a cynical attempt that right, there are all kinds of friction points in society, and to actually have the government increasing that friction rather than decreasing it, I think is highly problematic. And particularly where, in the way that they worked this case, they had taken the young man out to the woods somewhere, I don't even know where it was, I think it was outside Corvallis, to test the explosive. And they did a test. Game over, right? That fake bomb actually went off, right? They could hear the boom. So they could have arrested him right then. There was no reason to do this theatrical event in Portland with a fake bomb. That was all for you. That wasn't to arrest him. That was for show. That was to create an anxiety within the community that would then justify what the FBI was doing. And, unfortunately, they said counsel. It worked, and it put more participation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. There was a May Day protest in Seattle in 2012 where some windows got broken, which is sad for the people whose windows they were. But I wouldn't call that terrorism. But the Joint Terrorism Task Force got involved and had in fact been surveilling anarchists, so-called anarchists, what the FBI called anarchists, here in Portland, including some who did not go to the protest. So we're not there, we're not suspected of being involved in breaking a courthouse window, but the FBI used the pretext of the fact that they broke a federal courthouse window as a federal crime to conduct armed raids, and similar to what we're hearing, what they're collecting is anarchist literature, signs, black clothing. I looked at those search warrants, and they weren't looking for explosive devices, they weren't looking for illegal weapons, they weren't looking for any weapons. It was literally literature that they were looking for. But they also used the grand jury, which is a very powerful tool for investigation. And when these activists, again, who were not there, have no information about who broke the window, realized that the grand jury was going to be used to get them to expand on who were their friends and who else was involved in the political movement. So they chose not to participate and went to jail and were put in jail for months. I think 6 months was the longest before the judge finally determined that they weren't going to speak and let them go. Turns out that they knew who broke the window. They arrested him that day, and he had pled guilty and wasn't part of any organized anarchist group and was sentenced to 2 months in jail. So the guy who actually did it went to jail for less times than people who weren't actually there. And I believe that this is part of an effort like COINTELPRO to suppress political activity. In San Francisco, I want to say it was 2012. My years might be off. A lot happened in 2012. There was an effort based on the 2011 ordinance here that California has a state law similar to the Oregon law that says they need reasonable suspicion before they can gather criminal intelligence. They have a long history in San Francisco of the red squads going out and investigating people because of their political activity. So they had these strong rules, and that question came up, well, wait a minute, if Portland can create this ordinance to regulate the activity and to get transparency, we should have it too. So San Francisco passed an ordinance that was very similar in that it didn't really limit activities so much as just ask for transparency. We want to know how these officers on the task force are being used, what kind of cases they're being used, whether they're being used in this assessment sort of category where they're not complying with their own state law. And similar to what happened here, the law enforcement officers, including the state and locals that were participating, were reluctant to share that information with the public and weren't providing the kinds of reports that were required. So when there was finally push came to shove, show us the report, they said, we'll just pull out. And they withdrew in February. And San Francisco is still around. Again, there's a lot of fear-mongering around this, but investigating innocent people doesn't help find guilty people. It's not an issue. Law enforcement has a lot of authority. They should focus that where people are actually being harmed, not where somebody thinks somebody in the future might somehow be a threat. The first thing that would probably happen is the FBI would call a local police officer who works on these issues and say, tell me about him. Tell me about this person. We're concerned that they might be doing this, but what information do you have about any of their activities? There's the issue of security clearances. A lot of times the information the FBI gathers is highly classified because they're using these national security methods. But even, so there are a number of police officers that have security clearances, and those security clearances can remain. But even where there isn't one, like Kimberly mentioned, the mayors weren't given security clearances. It's a routine practice that if there's a reason to be sharing information with a particular person, even though they don't have a clearance, you can give them a non-disclosure agreement. It's routine, it happens all the time. It could happen here just as easily.
I think that it does undermine our sanctuary state and our sanctuary city status for Portland to be part of the JTTF, because ICE is a member of the JTTF, and granted, there's things ICE are doing that we don't agree with, and when we say we're not going to be collaborating with ICE, and yet then there's this sort of secrecy and we don't know what's happening. I think it undermines the public's ability to believe in our sanctuary state and city laws.